Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. The Late Night Delivery Man. It was one of those nights when everything felt a little off, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I had just finished a long day at work, and after a quick dinner, I was ready to relax. I settled onto my couch. The only sound in the house was the low hum of the TV and the occasional creak of the floorboards. It was late, close to midnight, and I had no plans of going anywhere. I was looking forward to the quiet of the night. Then, out of nowhere, there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. My friends and family knew I'd be asleep by now, and I didn't order anything. I walked to the door, my feet heavy with confusion. Who could it be at this hour? When I opened the door, I was greeted by a man holding a food delivery bag. "Delivery for you," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I stared at him, trying to piece together what was happening. "I didn't order anything," I told him, voice thick with confusion. I double-checked the address on the bag, and it was mine. The man's smile remained unchanged, as if he hadn't heard me. "It was sent to you," he insisted, his tone almost too calm. "It's for you." I blinked, still trying to figure out what was going on. Maybe it was some sort of mistake, but why would anyone send food to me without letting me know? Something about him felt off, but I wasn't sure what. He was dressed like any other delivery driver, wearing the typical uniform, but there was an unsettling stillness to his presence. "Are you sure this is for me?" I asked again, just to make sure I wasn't missing something. He nodded, his eyes locked on mine. "Yes, it's for you." He didn't move, just waited there, his hand still extended, waiting for me to take the bag. I hesitated but eventually took it, unsure of what else to do. I tried to thank him, but he turned and started walking away before I could even get the words out. I closed the door, confused and a little uneasy. The delivery guy hadn't acted like anyone I had dealt with before. It was almost as if he wanted me to take the food, but not in a normal, businesslike way. More like he was expecting me to. But why? I set the bag down on the kitchen counter and looked at it for a moment, wondering if I should just toss it out. But, against my better judgment, I opened it. Inside was a meal, something simple, like a sandwich and fries. Nothing fancy, but I didn't recognize it. Part of me wanted to call the delivery service, but something stopped me. Maybe I was just overthinking it. So, I sat down and started eating. But as I chewed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Something in the air felt heavy, like I wasn't alone. It was a familiar unease, the kind you feel when you think someone's watching you, but when you look, no one's there. I couldn't explain why, but I felt a tightness in my chest. I was sure I'd heard something outside the window just a few minutes ago. A sound, almost like a soft tap. But when I checked, the street was empty. Still, the feeling lingered, refusing to go away. I finished the meal, but I couldn't shake the thought, who sent this to me? And why didn't I remember ordering it? After finishing my food, I decided to get some sleep. But no matter how tired I was, I couldn't relax. There was an itch in the back of my mind, something I couldn't quite place. I tried to ignore it, but it wouldn't go away. It was as if I had let something in, something that wasn't supposed to be here. I lay awake in the dark, listening to the faint creaks and groans of the house. Outside, everything was still, quiet, but somehow The silence felt wrong, like it was waiting for something to break it, waiting for the next knock. The night dragged on, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept telling myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was just the weird late-night delivery, the strange guy, the unsettling quiet. But every time I tried to close my eyes, something gnawed at the back of my mind, refusing to let me drift off. I finally decided to check the security cameras. I had them set up around the house. Just a habit, I guess. They were connected to my phone, so it was easy to pull up the footage from the front door. I scrolled through the videos, fast-forwarding until I saw the timestamp that matched the time the delivery had arrived. I watched closely, waiting to see what had happened when the man had knocked on the door. But when the footage played, my stomach dropped. The delivery guy was still there. I stared at the screen, heart pounding. The video showed him dropping the bag off and leaving, exactly as I remembered. But the odd part, the footage continued, and the man didn't walk away. He was just standing there, on the sidewalk, barely visible in the dim light from the porch, staring directly at my house. His body was completely still, almost unnervingly so, like he wasn't a real person at all. Just a statue, frozen in place, watching. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I was sure I hadn't seen him standing there when I closed the door earlier. Why would he still be outside, just staring at my house? It made no sense. I rewound the footage, watching him again. His expression hadn't changed. He hadn't moved. I zoomed in on his face, trying to get a better look, but the camera was a bit grainy in the dark. I could make out his features, just enough to see that his eyes were wide open, almost too wide, like he was waiting for something. But there was no emotion, no urgency, just stillness. I don't know how long I stared at the screen, but it felt like forever. Something felt terribly wrong. It wasn't just the fact that he was still there. It was the fact that I hadn't seen him when I closed the door, that I hadn't noticed him standing out there at all. I couldn't explain it. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the live feed again, checking the current view from the front porch camera. There was nothing. No one. Just an empty street under the flickering streetlights. But why couldn't I shake the feeling that I wasn't alone? I went back to the video, hoping I had just imagined things, but there it was again, the delivery guy, still standing. And then I saw him take a step. He didn't move fast, just a slow, deliberate step toward the house. My breath caught in my throat. It was like he was moving, but the footage seemed off, as if the moment had been stretched, distorted. I had to blink twice to make sure I was seeing it correctly. I pulled up the footage again, and this time I was watching more closely. His face, pale, almost ghostly, was still staring. But now, his body was angled toward the window where I was sitting, and I felt a chill race down my spine. It was like he knew. He knew exactly where I was. And the more I watched, the more I became certain of one thing. He was waiting. Waiting for me to make the next move. Waiting for me to open the door again. I jumped when I heard a sound from outside. A soft tap on the window, faint but distinct. I slowly turned my head toward the window, the same window that had been just a few feet away from me only minutes before. My pulse raced. I knew what I'd see, him, standing right outside, still staring, still waiting. But the window was empty. I rushed over to it, my heart pounding in my chest. The street was deserted. There was no one in sight. I quickly checked the other windows, scanning the shadows outside, but there was nothing. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But something didn't sit right. I went back to my phone, trying to reassure myself that I was just overthinking things. But as I scrolled through the footage again, I noticed something else. There was something new in the background. A shadow. Dark, almost blending into the night. But it was there. Right behind the delivery guy in the footage. It wasn't moving, but it was there. And just like that, the unease in my stomach doubled, like a heavy weight pressing down on me. I didn't know what to do next. All I knew was that I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And the more I stared at the screen, the more I realized the man wasn't the only thing out there. Something else was hiding in the shadows. And it was waiting too. I couldn't breathe. My hands were shaking as I held my phone, staring at the shadow in the footage. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, convinced that maybe it was just a trick of the light, a glitch in the camera. But when I looked again, the shadow was still there. Dark, unmoving, just beyond the delivery guy. It was too big to be a tree, too solid to be a trick of the camera. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. What was going on? Who was out there? Why was he still standing there? And what was that thing in the shadows? I started pacing the room, trying to calm myself down. My first instinct was to call the police, but then I thought about it. What could I even tell them? Hey, there's a delivery guy outside my house staring at me, and there's some weird shadow I can't explain. They'd probably think I was just some paranoid person freaking out over nothing. But the unease in my stomach told me this wasn't nothing. There was something wrong, something off about all of it. I took a deep breath and checked the camera again, desperate for some kind of explanation. The footage was the same. The guy was still there, staring blankly. His eyes, wide open, never blinked, never moved. And the shadow, that horrible shadow, was still there, lurking behind him. A sudden knock on my door made me jump so violently I almost dropped my phone. My heart raced, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen. It was impossible, right? There was no way it could be the delivery guy. I had just checked the cameras. He hadn't moved. The knock came again, louder this time, more urgent. My eyes flicked to the door, then back to the phone in my hand. I could see my front porch clearly. No one was there. I took a slow step toward the door, my heart in my throat. I shouldn't open it. My mind screamed at me to lock it up, stay inside, and call for help. But curiosity, and maybe fear, got the better of me. I peered through the peephole, half expecting to see the delivery guy standing there, his face expressionless. But when I looked, the porch was empty. I felt a strange relief wash over me, but it was short-lived. I noticed something else. The shadows on the porch, behind the railing, by the bushes, seemed wrong, like they were shifting, moving. But when I blinked, they were still. I couldn't explain it. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, like the world outside was warping, twisting into something wrong. I backed away from the door, hands shaking even more now. I thought about calling someone, but who could help me? What was even happening? Was it just a strange coincidence? Or was someone, something, really out there? I stood there for a moment, listening for any other sounds. The house was quiet, unnervingly so. Then, without warning, I heard another knock. But this time, it wasn't from the front door. It came from the back of the house. The back door. I nearly tripped over my feet as I rushed to the living room window, peering out into the darkness. I could just make out the vague silhouette of my backyard, but there was nothing there. No delivery guy. No shadow. Just darkness. My pulse pounded in my ears. I didn't know what to do. The knocking was still coming. Soft, almost rhythmic, as if whoever or whatever was out there was waiting for me to answer. That's when I realized something. I had locked all the doors. I was sure of it. I hadn't gone anywhere since the delivery had arrived. So how was someone knocking on my back door? My head spun. I grabbed my phone, trying to focus, trying to find some logical explanation, but there was nothing. The footage from the security cameras hadn't changed. The delivery guy was still standing there. Still watching. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. I checked the back door through the camera, but there was nothing there. No one in sight. The knocking had stopped, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread fill me. The calm after the storm. But I knew it wasn't over. I walked to the back door, hands clammy. The floorboards creaked under my feet. I paused with my hand on the doorknob, then slowly, cautiously, turned it. The door didn't open. It was locked. I stepped back, confused. The lock was still secure. Then I saw it, small but there. The faintest outline of something dark, pushed against the window of the back door. It was a figure. A person. The shape was blurry, indistinct, but it was there, just on the other side of the glass. I stepped back quickly, my heart pounding. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't alone. Someone, or something, was standing right outside. And it wasn't the delivery guy. The knocking resumed, but this time it was frantic, desperate. I stumbled back from the door, my mind reeling. What was happening? Who was out there? What did they want? The darkness in the yard seemed to stretch closer, and I was running out of time to figure out what was real and what was something else. I couldn't take it anymore. My heart was hammering in my chest, and my hands were clammy with sweat. The knocking on the back door continued, the sound growing more frantic with each passing second. Whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't leaving. I had to do something. Anything. I rushed to the phone, hands shaking so badly that I almost dropped it. I dialed 911, my thumb pressing the numbers too quickly. The line rang for what felt like forever before the operator answered. 911, what's your emergency? Someone's outside my house, I gasped, barely able to speak. They've been knocking on my door, my back door. And I've been watching them on the cameras, and they just won't leave. Ma'am, stay calm, the operator said, trying to sound reassuring. Can you tell me your address? I gave it to them, my voice barely above a whisper, my eyes glued to the back door. The knocking had stopped for a moment, but I could feel the presence on the other side, as if they were just waiting, watching. Help is on the way, the operator said. Stay inside, and lock all your doors and windows. Do you have any weapons or anything to defend yourself with? No, I said, my voice shaky. I've locked everything, but I can't see them anymore. I don't know where they went. I turned to the back door, my heart skipping a beat when I realized it was silent. Too silent. I checked the cameras again, but the footage from the back of the house was still empty. The figure, the shadow, was gone. Then, just as I exhaled in relief, I heard something. It was a low, muffled sound, like something scraping against the glass. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The back door. The figure was there again, standing just out of sight, right by the glass. I could only see the outline, but I could tell that it was moving. Slowly, methodically, almost like it was waiting for me to make a move. I backed away from the window, not wanting to get any closer. My head was spinning. This was impossible. The police were on their way. I was safe, I had to be. But then I saw it. The reflection. I saw it in the glass of the back door. Another figure. It was standing behind me, in the reflection, staring right at me with hollow eyes. The shape was tall, thin, and dark, like it didn't belong. I whirled around, my pulse racing, but there was nothing. No one. I turned back to the door, my breath shallow and ragged. The figure was still there, in the reflection, as if it had never left. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin as panic clawed at my chest. The knocking started again, louder this time, more violent, shaking the door with every strike. I jumped back, nearly tripping over the furniture as I scrambled toward the living room. I couldn't think straight. What was happening? Why was this happening? Suddenly, I heard it, a voice. It was faint at first, like it was coming from far away. But it grew clearer. And then, unmistakably, I heard the words, "Let me in." My blood ran cold. I couldn't breathe. The voice was unmistakable. It was the delivery guy. But how? He was outside, wasn't he? And he'd been standing there for hours. I ran to the front door, heart racing, my head spinning. There was no one on the porch. No delivery guy. Nothing but the silence. I checked the cameras again. The yard was empty. The backyard, empty. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, standing on the edge of the street, just beyond the reach of the porch light. The delivery guy. He was standing perfectly still, his eyes wide open, staring directly at me. He hadn't moved. He hadn't blinked. And then, slowly, he raised his hand. He waved. A slow, deliberate wave. I froze. Every muscle in my body locked up. I couldn't move. Couldn't speak. I stared back at him, heart pounding in my chest. And then the voice came again, from inside my house, from right behind me. "Let me in." I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the empty house, the silent rooms, and the feeling of something watching me. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I wasn't alone. It was only a matter of time before whatever was out there, whatever had been following me, would get inside, and I didn't know if I'd be able to stop it. I could feel my body trembling, every nerve on edge, as I backed away from the door. My mind was racing. This couldn't be real, I thought. It couldn't be. The things I had seen, the delivery guy, the shadow on the edge of the street, the voice in my house, none of it made sense. Yet, everything in me screamed that it was happening, that it was real. I backed into the living room, trying to put as much distance between me and the front door as I could. I could hear the faintest scratching sound against the wood of the door frame. It was like fingernails dragging slowly, deliberately, a sound so wrong that it made my blood run cold. I turned, searching for something, anything, to defend myself. But there was nothing. Nothing but the creeping silence. My phone was still in my hand, but I hadn't even thought to call the police again. What would I even say? A delivery guy is standing outside my house, and I think he might be. I don't know. Not human. I was losing my grip on reality, on what was real. I darted to the window, checking again, desperate to find something that would explain all of this. But there was nothing outside. No one. The street was empty, and the only movement I could see was the flickering of the streetlights casting eerie shadows on the pavement. But then I saw it. Just a flicker. The faintest movement, like something shifting in the dark. I couldn't help it. I opened the window just a crack. I had to know. I had to know if I was being followed, if someone was out there. And then I heard it again. A voice. It wasn't the delivery guy anymore. It was something deeper, something far more sinister, whispering into the silence. "You're not alone." I froze. I turned around so quickly I nearly tripped over my own feet. But the house was still silent. Empty. No one was there. I felt my heart drop into my stomach as I scanned the room. My head was spinning, my vision narrowing. Was I losing my mind? Or was there really something in my house? The voice came again, louder this time, right behind me, like it was speaking directly into my ear. "Let me in." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the nearest object, an old, heavy lamp, and swung it at the back door, as if that would keep whatever was out there from getting in. I didn't know what I was expecting. I wasn't thinking straight. I just knew I needed to do something before it was too late. And then I saw it, him. The delivery guy was standing right at the back door, his face pale, his eyes wide open, unblinking. He was smiling now. But it wasn't a smile of reassurance. It was something darker, something that made my skin crawl. I backed away from the door, unable to look away from him, unable to make sense of anything. I glanced at the cameras again, hoping for some kind of answer, some sign that I wasn't going crazy. But there was no footage from the back door. The screen was blank. And then, all at once, the lights flickered. The entire house plunged into darkness. I stood frozen, holding my breath, trying not to panic. The power was out. The silence was overwhelming. I couldn't see a thing, not even the faint glow from the streetlight outside. I was engulfed in blackness, alone in my house with whatever was out there. I heard the door creak slowly, the hinges whining with age. I couldn't breathe. My heart was beating so fast I thought it would burst from my chest. I turned around, hearing footsteps now. Slow, heavy footsteps, like someone was walking toward me in the dark. And then the whisper came again, from right in front of me this time. "I'm inside." I couldn't scream. My throat was dry, my mouth unable to make a sound. I stumbled backward, but my feet tangled in the carpet. I hit the ground hard, the air knocked out of me. And then I saw him, the delivery guy. He was standing in the doorway of the living room, his shadow stretched long across the floor, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. He took one slow step toward me, and then his smile widened, impossibly wide, as he whispered the words that would haunt me forever. "Did you think I'd leave?" I reached for the lamp again, my hand shaking, but before I could even move, I felt a cold, clammy hand wrap around my wrist. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then, as the darkness consumed me, I heard one final whisper, low and chilling. "You were never alone." And then everything went black. The next morning, the police arrived. They found the front door wide open, the back door unlocked, but there was no sign of a struggle. No sign of the delivery guy. They searched the house, the yard, the street, but found nothing. The cameras, they were all gone. Not a single frame of footage existed. And the food, it was still sitting there on the kitchen counter, untouched, as though it had never been delivered in the first place. As I sit here, typing this out, I still hear the voice. Every night, it comes back. Soft at first, but then louder, closer. I don't know who, or what, was at my door that night. But I know one thing for sure: I'll never be alone again.
Shadows in the backyard.
I've always been the kind of person who finds peace in solitude. Living alone in a quiet suburban neighborhood felt like the perfect fit for me. My little house, nestled at the end of a cul-de-sac, had a charm to it: a cozy living room, creaky hardwood floors, and a spacious backyard surrounded by towering trees. It felt like my own little haven. At least, it did at first. The first time I noticed something strange, it was a Tuesday night. I remember because I had just finished washing the dishes and was sitting by the window with a cup of chamomile tea. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long, jagged shadows across the yard. That's when I saw it, a shadow that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Maybe a raccoon or a stray cat had wandered too close to the house. But the way it moved, slow, deliberate, almost purposeful, made my stomach tighten. It wasn't shaped like an animal. It was tall, thin, and seemed to shift unnaturally, as though the edges of it were dissolving into the night. I froze, my tea forgotten in my hands, and stared out into the yard, hoping for a better look. But as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I let out a shaky breath and tried to convince myself it was nothing. Shadows could be tricky, I told myself. The mind plays tricks when you're alone. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows before going to bed, something I rarely bothered with before. As I lay in bed, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my mind. The next morning, I stepped out into the yard to reassure myself. Nothing was out of place. The grass was damp with dew, the trees stood still, and there was no sign of any intruder. I laughed at myself, feeling silly for letting a trick of the light rattle me. But that night, it happened again. This time, I saw it from my bedroom window. The same shadow, moving between the trees, its outline flickering like a bad signal on a TV screen. I turned on the porch light, hoping to scare it off or catch a clearer view, but the yard was empty. The shadow was gone. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring into the yard, my heart pounding in my chest. Was someone out there? Was I being watched? I didn't know what scared me more, the thought that someone might be lurking in the darkness, or the possibility that no one was. By the third night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The shadow wasn't just an illusion or a coincidence. It was real, and it was coming closer. The next night, I couldn't bring myself to sit by the window. The uneasiness had burrowed deep into my chest, growing heavier with every passing hour. I turned on every light in the house, trying to drown out the darkness that pressed against the windows. But even with the glow of the lamps, I felt the weight of something outside, just beyond the glass. Around midnight, I heard it. A faint rustling, like leaves brushing against one another, but there was no wind that night. My body stiffened, every hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Slowly, I walked to the window, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass and peered into the yard. At first, I didn't see anything. The trees stood still, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The grass was untouched. But then, there it was, closer this time. The shadow. It was moving across the yard, gliding rather than walking, its edges rippling as though it were made of smoke. My heart thudded in my chest, so loud I thought it might drown out the sound of my shallow breaths. I couldn't tell if it had a face, but I felt its focus, its attention, locked onto me. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it into the yard, the beam slicing through the darkness. But the moment the light hit where the shadow had been, it vanished. Just like that, gone. I stared into the empty yard, trying to convince myself it had been a trick of the light or maybe my imagination running wild. But when I turned off the flashlight, my stomach dropped. The shadow was back. It was closer now, lingering near the edge of the porch. My porch. The space that separated me from it was shrinking. Panic surged through me, and I bolted to the door, double-checking the lock, twisting the deadbolt as tight as it would go. My hands were clammy, my breathing uneven. "Who's out there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. There was no answer. Just the silence of the night, heavy and oppressive. I stayed up the rest of the night, pacing between the windows and checking the locks, the sense of unease growing with every shadow that flickered across the walls. By morning, I was exhausted but determined. That day, I went out and bought motion-activated floodlights and new locks for the doors and windows. I even called a handyman to reinforce the frames. If someone was trying to scare me, or worse, they weren't getting in. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I turned on every light I had installed. The yard was illuminated as if it were daytime, the harsh white glow washing over the grass and trees. For the first time in days, I felt a sliver of relief. But when midnight came, so did the shadows. And this time, they didn't stay in the yard. I don't know what I was expecting, but it wasn't that. It started the same way as the other nights. The stillness, the eerie quiet that seemed to creep under my skin as soon as the lights in the house dimmed. I had set up the floodlights, convinced that nothing could survive in the blinding white light. The shadow, however, didn't care. At first, I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. It had been a few days since the shadows first appeared, and though they seemed to get closer with every passing night, I couldn't help but wonder if my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe the new lights had triggered some strange optical illusion, or maybe I was just so used to being alone that I was imagining things. But that night, as I sat on the couch, my eyes glued to the TV, something pulled my attention to the window. The floodlights illuminated the yard, but the shadows, they were different now. They were moving against the light. They shouldn't have been able to do that. I froze, my body stiff as a board. The shadows didn't belong there. They weren't cast by the trees or anything in the yard. They seemed to form from the very air, twisting and shifting as though they were alive. I could see them, long and thin, creeping along the edges of the light, inching closer to the house. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I considered calling someone. Anyone. But who would believe me? Who would understand what was happening here? I had to confront it myself. I grabbed my phone, hoping that the camera could capture something, anything, so I could prove I wasn't losing my mind. I opened the camera app, switched to video, and aimed the phone out the window. I thought, maybe if I recorded it, I could watch it back and make sense of it. As I focused the lens on the yard, I saw the shadows again. But this time, they were closer, too close. The air around them seemed to shimmer, as if they were distorting the space itself. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. There was something wrong with them. Something unnatural. I couldn't help it. I stepped closer to the window, hoping to get a better look. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing perfectly still just beyond the light, in the far corner of the yard. It was tall, too tall, its form indistinct, a shadow within a shadow. But I knew it was there. A loud bang echoed through the house. I jumped, the phone slipping from my hand. My heart slammed against my ribs. The noise was sharp, like something hitting the side of the house. Panic surged through me. I grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, holding it like a weapon as I rushed to check the doors. But there was nothing. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I went back to the window, my mind racing with fear. I expected the shadow to be gone, to have melted back into the darkness, but it was still there, motionless, just standing, watching. That's when I realized it was not alone. There were more. Silhouettes. Smaller, moving around in the yard, lurking in the dark corners. They were everywhere. And the worst part, they weren't just outside anymore. I could see them through the window, but they were no longer confined to the yard. The shadows had moved closer, inching along the walls, pressing against the glass as if trying to reach inside. I felt the air grow thick, heavy with a presence that made my skin crawl. Something was coming closer. Something was trying to get in. And this time, I wasn't sure I could keep it out. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking. I checked the locks again, my heart thumping in my ears. The floodlights were still on, but I felt the darkness creeping in, creeping up the walls, around the corners, closing in on me. I didn't know what I was dealing with, but one thing was certain. It wasn't going to leave until it had what it wanted. The nights were becoming unbearable. I could feel it. Something was wrong in a way I couldn't explain. Something beyond the shadows. Something that lingered just outside my perception, watching, waiting. I thought about leaving. I thought about packing my things, going somewhere, anywhere, but I couldn't shake the feeling that even if I did, it would follow me. The shadows weren't just confined to my yard anymore. They had seeped into my home, into my life. I could feel them when I walked into a room, as if they were brushing up against me, unseen, but there. I'd hear noises, soft whispers almost, like the wind rustling through dry leaves, but there was no wind. I would turn, expecting to see a shadow in the corner of the room, but nothing was ever there. I tried everything I could think of, locking the doors, closing the blinds, putting up more lights, even calling a friend to stay with me for a night. But nothing worked. I was alone with my fear, and the presence was closing in. It was the 5th night since the shadows first appeared, and I was beyond exhausted. I hadn't slept properly, hadn't eaten. I was living on caffeine and fear. I spent the evening pacing, my eyes darting to every corner of the house. I hadn't dared to go outside, even though I felt the pull of the yard, like something was drawing me to it. But I knew I couldn't leave. I couldn't let whatever was out there see me weaken. I was sitting in the living room, clutching a blanket tightly around me, my eyes fixed on the camera feed I'd set up. The cameras were my last line of defense. They were supposed to help me figure out what was going on, to capture the truth that no one would believe. Maybe I could finally understand what was haunting me, what was lurking in the darkness. I watched the screen intently, the static of the video feed flickering across my vision. Nothing. For what seemed like hours, the yard was empty, the shadows still and silent. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And then I saw it. At first, it was subtle, just a slight shift in the air. But then the shadow moved, slow and deliberate, right in front of the camera. It was no longer just a shape. It was something else entirely. The figure was different now. It was no longer just a flickering blur at the edge of the yard. It was solid, and it stood up straight, towering over the grass like a man, but wrong. Its limbs were elongated, far too long for a human body, and its form was distorted, like a patchwork of shadows stitched together. The thing stood still, its shape twisting and contorting in unnatural ways. Its face. I didn't even want to look at it. I knew if I focused on it too long, I would see something that would stay with me forever. But the worst part, I could hear it now. The softest sound, barely perceptible over the sound of my own breathing. A whisper. A voice. "Help me." The voice came through the camera feed, but it wasn't just a sound. It was a feeling, a sensation that crawled under my skin and dug deep into my bones. It wasn't asking for help, it was demanding it. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't look away from the screen. The figure's head snapped towards the camera, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise. I was no longer in control of this situation. The whispering grew louder, more frantic. "Help me." It was clear now. It wasn't asking for help from me. It was telling me what to do. I felt a strange compulsion, like something was pulling me out of my seat, urging me to step outside, to go to it. My body moved against my will, my feet carrying me toward the door without hesitation. As I stood by the door, the lights flickering around me, I knew deep down that once I opened it, there would be no going back. The thing that was waiting outside had taken something from me already, and I was terrified of what it would take next. But I opened the door anyway. The door creaked open, louder than I expected, the sound echoing in the stillness of the house. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come next. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might burst out of my chest. I stood there, staring into the blackness of the yard, the floodlights casting long, jagged shadows that twisted like tendrils, stretching toward me. I don't know why I stepped outside. Maybe I thought I could confront it, face whatever was haunting me head-on. Or maybe a part of me just wanted the torment to end. But the moment I crossed the threshold, I knew it was already too late. The air felt different out here, heavy, thick with an almost suffocating pressure. The shadows seemed to move, not just in the corners of my vision, but everywhere. They were no longer just on the edges of the yard. They were in the air itself, like a blanket of darkness wrapping itself around me. And there, standing at the edge of the floodlight's reach, was the figure. It was more defined now, more solid, and somehow closer. Its shape seemed to ripple, shifting like liquid, never fully stable. I could see its long, spindly arms hanging by its sides, its head tilting slightly, as though it was studying me, waiting for something. That whisper, no, that command, came again, sharp and insistent. "Help me!" I could feel it now, deep inside of me, that pull, that urge to go toward it. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn around and run, to get back inside and lock the door, but my body refused to obey. It was like a dream where you know something's wrong, but you can't wake up, can't escape. I walked closer. Each step felt like it took forever, my feet moving in slow motion, but I couldn't stop. The air around me grew colder, and the shadows seemed to press in on me, closing the space between me and the figure. It was standing at the far corner of the yard now, just beyond the reach of the light, but I could still feel its presence, thick and suffocating. I reached out a hand, as if to touch it. That was when I felt it. A cold, clammy hand grabbed my wrist. It was like ice, so cold it burned. I tried to pull away, but the grip tightened, its fingers digging into my skin. I turned my head, my eyes wide with panic, and that's when I saw it, the face. There was no face, not really. Just a mass of shifting shadows where the features should have been, writhing and swirling as though they couldn't hold a shape. But from within that darkness, I saw eyes. Eyes that weren't eyes at all, just dark pits that seemed to look right into my soul. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The grip on my wrist tightened even more, and I was pulled forward, my body forced to take a step closer to it. I could feel the darkness seeping into me, filling my lungs, my veins, my mind. It was suffocating, overwhelming. And then, in that moment, the voice came again, closer this time, right in my ear, as though it was inside my head. Help me! I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. There was nothing but that voice, that presence, and the shadows that had already consumed everything around me. I don't know how long I was standing there, frozen, in the grip of whatever had taken hold of me. I can't remember how I got back inside. All I know is that when I finally snapped out of it, I was back at the door, my heart racing, my body trembling from head to toe. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it for the last time. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there for what felt like hours, trying to understand what had just happened. But I couldn't. I couldn't make sense of it. I couldn't escape it. The shadows were still out there, still watching. And I knew, with a sick certainty in my gut, that they would never leave. They had taken something from me, and now they were waiting. Waiting for me to step outside again, waiting for me to make the final mistake. I don't know how much longer I'll be able to keep them at bay. But I know one thing for sure. The shadows are patient, and they always get what they want. The end, or just the beginning.
The last cry for help.
It was just another quiet night in my apartment. I was sitting at my desk, surrounded by the soft hum of my computer and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. Living alone had its perks. No one to bother me, no one to interrupt my late-night productivity. Seattle's rain drummed lightly against the window, and the distant sound of cars passing on wet streets filled the silence. I liked nights like these, predictable and uneventful, until my phone rang. The sharp sound cut through the calm, startling me. I glanced at the screen. An unknown number. Normally, I'd let it go to voicemail, but something about it made me hesitate. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the strange sense of dread that crept up my spine. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Hello," I said, my voice firm but cautious. For a moment, all I heard was static. Then, faintly, a voice broke through. A woman's voice, trembling and desperate. "Please, help me. I'm trapped in the dark. I can't get out." I froze. The words were barely audible, like she was whispering from the other side of a storm. "Who is this? Where are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. But she didn't answer my questions. Her breathing grew faster, panicked. "They're coming. I can't hide anymore. Who's coming?" I demanded, standing up from my chair. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat forming on my palms. Suddenly, the line went dead. I stared at the screen, my breath shallow. For a moment, I convinced myself it was some sort of prank. People call the wrong numbers all the time, don't they? Maybe she meant to call someone else. But deep down, I couldn't shake the unease settling over me. I sat back down, trying to focus on my work again, but my mind wouldn't stop replaying her voice. That desperation, it felt too real. The rain outside grew heavier, and with each drop, the silence in my apartment seemed to grow louder. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. Just a random call, nothing to worry about. I turned off the lights and crawled into bed, hoping sleep would wash away the strange anxiety I felt. But as I lay there in the dark, I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep well after that call. Every sound in my apartment seemed louder, every shadow longer. When morning came, I convinced myself it was just my overactive imagination. But that resolve didn't last long. The next night, it happened again. It was nearly midnight when my phone rang. The same number. My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen, the glow of the caller ID illuminating my room in a pale light. Part of me wanted to let it ring, but curiosity, or maybe fear, got the better of me. I picked up. "Hello." At first, nothing. Then the same voice, only now it was even more frantic. "They're coming for me. Please. Don't let them find you." "Who's coming?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but it cracked under the weight of the moment. "They don't like it when you dig," she whispered, the words nearly lost in the static. "You have to stop." Before I could say anything else, the call cut off again. My hands trembled as I placed the phone on the desk. What the hell was going on? I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a prank. Her voice. It felt too raw, too terrified. I needed answers. Pulling up a reverse phone lookup site on my computer, I typed in the number. It took a moment to load, and I leaned back, my heart racing. When the results popped up, I felt the blood drain from my face. The number was registered to a woman named Evelyn Harper. I didn't recognize the name, but that wasn't what sent chills down my spine. Evelyn Harper had been declared dead 5 years ago. My pulse quickened as I skimmed the basic information about her. A local woman who went missing and was found dead under mysterious circumstances. My screen showed a grainy photo of her, a smiling woman with soft features and kind eyes. It didn't match the fear I'd heard in her voice. Maybe the number was reassigned, I muttered to myself, trying to sound logical, but even as I said it, the explanation didn't sit right. Something about this felt wrong. Then I saw it, a brief note about her death. Evelyn's body had been discovered in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Her phone had been found clutched in her hand, its screen cracked but still intact. I leaned back, staring at the screen as my heart thudded painfully in my chest. That's when my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a call. It was a voicemail from the same number. My fingers hovered over the play button for what felt like an eternity. Finally, I pressed it. Static filled the room, followed by a faint, choked whisper. "Help me, before it's too late." The message ended abruptly, leaving me in the deafening silence of my apartment. My skin prickled as I glanced around the room. For the first time in my life, I felt genuinely afraid of the dark. I couldn't shake the voicemail from my mind. The desperation in her voice, it gnawed at me, made me feel like I'd stumbled into something I was never supposed to hear. For the rest of the night, I paced the apartment, double-checking the locks on my doors and windows, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. By dawn, I convinced myself that I needed answers. I couldn't keep living with this unsettling feeling in my chest. I started researching Evelyn Harper. The details were sparse, but they painted a grim picture. She was a Seattle local, like me, and had disappeared one rainy evening while heading home from work. Weeks later, her body was found in an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. No signs of foul play, no suspects, just a young woman gone too soon. Her case had gone cold. That's when the strange things started happening. The first was subtle, a flicker of the lights in my apartment. At first, I chalked it up to the old wiring in the building. But as the hours passed, the flickering became more frequent, always at night, always when I was alone. Then came the sounds. I was sitting at my desk, trying to distract myself with work, when I heard it, a soft creak, like someone stepping on the hardwood floor. My head shot up, and I stared into the empty living room. Nothing. But then it happened again. A faint, deliberate creak, this time closer to the hallway. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I grabbed the heaviest object within reach, a metal desk lamp, and crept toward the hallway. My heart pounded as I flipped on the light, illuminating the narrow corridor. It was empty, of course, but the air felt wrong, heavier, colder, as if the room itself was holding its breath. I tried to laugh it off, told myself I was just jumpy because of the calls. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every muscle in my body tense. Around 2 a.m., I heard the faint hum of my phone. A new voicemail. I didn't play it right away. I couldn't. Instead, I just stared at the screen, the notification taunting me, daring me to press play. Finally, after what felt like hours, I tapped it. Static, faint and crackling. Then, her voice again. "They're closer now," she whispered. "Don't trust the dark. They'll find you if you do." The line went dead, but the words lingered. I sat there in the dim glow of my phone, the shadows in my apartment suddenly seeming alive. That's when I noticed it, the draft. It was faint at first, a cold breeze brushing against my face. But then I realized something that sent a shiver down my spine. The draft was coming from behind me. I turned slowly, every nerve in my body screaming at me to stop. But when I looked, there was nothing there. Just the open window, swaying slightly in the wind. Except I hadn't opened it. Something was in my apartment, and it wanted me to know it. The open window haunted me. I couldn't explain it, why it was open or how I didn't notice it before, but it filled me with a sense of dread so deep I could barely breathe. I shut it quickly, locking it tight and pulling the curtains closed, but the damage was already done. My apartment, my sanctuary, no longer felt safe. I spent the next day in a haze, checking every corner of my home, searching for anything out of place. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, my nerves were raw, but I still hadn't found any answers. The air inside felt suffocating, thick with the weight of something unseen. I debated leaving, maybe staying in a hotel for the night, but deep down, I knew that whatever this was, it wouldn't stop. Running wouldn't solve anything. That night, I sat in my living room with every light in the apartment turned on. My phone sat on the coffee table, and I stared at it like it was a ticking bomb. I couldn't shake the feeling that another call was coming. And it did. The ringtone shattered the silence, and I flinched so hard I nearly dropped my drink. The screen lit up with the same unknown number. My hands trembled as I reached for it, dread pooling in my stomach. "Hello," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, there was nothing but static. Then her voice came through, faint but clear. "They're in the walls," she said. Her voice was hollow, detached. like she was speaking from a void. "They know you've been looking. They don't like it." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, standing up. "Who's in the walls? What do they want?" "You've seen them," she whispered. "In the shadows. In the corners. They're always watching." I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. Her words were like a knife twisting in my gut because I had seen something. Flickers in the corner of my eye. Shapes that didn't belong. At first, I told myself it was my imagination, tricks of the light. But now, hearing her say it out loud, I wasn't so sure. The line went dead again, and I was left standing in the middle of my living room, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Then the knocking started. It was soft at first, a gentle tap-tap-tap coming from the walls. I turned toward the sound, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear it. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, moving from one wall to another, as if something was inside, trying to get out. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice breaking. The knocking stopped. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, just as I thought it was over, the lights in my apartment flickered and went out, plunging me into complete darkness. I fumbled for my phone, using the flashlight to pierce the blackness. The beam of light danced across the walls, the furniture, the empty hallway. But the moment I thought I was alone, I saw it. A figure. It was standing in the corner of the room, just out of the flashlight's reach. A tall, shadowy form that seemed to absorb the light around it. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it watching me. And then, without warning, it whispered, in the same voice as Evelyn. "Too late." The flashlight flickered, and when the beam steadied again, the figure was gone. But the fear it left behind remained, suffocating me in its grip. I knew then that this wasn't over. Whatever had taken Evelyn was now coming for me. The figure's whisper echoed in my mind long after it vanished. Too late. The words felt like a death sentence. I stood frozen in the middle of my apartment, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. The flashlight beam wavered as my hands trembled, and every corner of the room felt alive with unseen eyes. I couldn't stay here. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the door, not bothering to pack anything. The hallway outside was eerily quiet, the air thick and stagnant. My footsteps echoed as I sprinted down the stairs and out onto the street. The chill of the night air hit me like a slap, but it did nothing to clear my head. I drove aimlessly for hours, my hands gripping the wheel, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. I half expected to see the shadowy figure sitting in the back seat, but it never appeared. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, even if I couldn't see it. Finally, as dawn broke, I pulled into a diner on the edge of town. The fluorescent lights and the smell of burnt coffee felt grounding, almost normal. I slid into a booth near the window, my phone clutched in my hand. That's when I noticed it. Another voicemail. My stomach churned as I stared at the notification. It had come while I was driving, only minutes ago. Taking a deep breath, I pressed play. The static was louder this time, almost deafening. Then, through the crackling noise, her voice emerged. "They're here. You can't run." I dropped the phone onto the table as if it had burned me, my heart hammering in my chest. My eyes darted around the diner, scanning the faces of the patrons, the staff, anyone who might be watching me. But everything seemed normal. Until the lights flickered. It was subtle at first, a brief dimming, but then they started pulsing erratically. The few other diners looked around, confused, but no one seemed panicked. Except me. I grabbed my phone and backed out of the booth, my eyes fixed on the shadows gathering in the corners of the room. They seemed to stretch, reaching toward me like long, grasping fingers. I ran outside, the early morning sun offering little comfort. My car was parked across the lot, but every step I took toward it felt heavier, like I was wading through water. I could feel it, the presence, the weight of it pressing against my back. When I finally reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The moment I climbed in and locked the doors, I saw it. In the rear-view mirror, the figure was there again. Not in the back seat this time, but in the reflection itself, as if it was inside the mirror, staring back at me with eyes that weren't eyes at all, just empty voids. I screamed and spun around, but the back seat was empty. The figure whispered again, its voice curling around my ears like smoke. "You opened the door. Now they're here." The engine roared to life as I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding out of the lot and down the empty road. I didn't know where I was going. Just away. Away from the figure, the calls, the whispers. But the farther I drove, the darker the world seemed to become. The sun, which had risen moments ago, now felt dim, as if swallowed by a thick, unnatural fog. And then my phone buzzed again. I didn't want to answer, but I couldn't help myself. With one hand on the wheel, I picked it up and pressed it to my ear. This time, the voice wasn't Evelyn's. It was deeper, colder, dripping with malice. "You can't escape. You're ours now." The line went dead, and the fog around me thickened, the road vanishing beneath my tires. I slammed on the brakes, but the car didn't stop. It just kept moving, as if pulled by an unseen force. And then, everything went silent. No engine, no wind, no sound at all. Just the oppressive stillness of the dark. I sat there, gripping the wheel, staring into the abyss ahead of me. And slowly, one by one, figures began to emerge from the shadows. Dozens of them, all faceless, all reaching for me. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the sound of Evelyn's voice, faint and broken. "I'm sorry. I tried to warn you."